Good Wednesday morning to you. As I went to bed last night, I listened to how hard the rains were coming down, and my mind was filled and kind of swimming with all of the things that are happening in our world. I made the mistake of not being able to fall asleep, and so I went on social media, and then I went to my BBC app because I like to listen to the news and watch the news through the BBC. And I started thinking about all of the horrific things that are happening in our world, not just here in our country, but all over the world. How COVID continues to have such an implications on our societies, on our way of life, but even more on our socioeconomical balance that exists in this world. How aid changes because of something we can't even see. At any rate, I was thinking about all this, and then I couldn't fall asleep, which you might think, well, of course you can't fall asleep. You have to get off your phone and stop watching the news and just find some kind of peace before you sleep. Well, eventually it did come, and I woke up. But I woke up still to the winds and the rains outside the window. In fact, I turned on the news to see exactly how much rain have we received, and what does flood watches look like in the valley. I was filled with the story of Jesus quieting the storm in that moment. You know, isn't that the truth? Isn't that our hope and consolation and faith? Is that in the midst of all that is happening, we trust and we believe that Jesus quiets the storm, that God is at work in the midst of the heartache and in the midst of the struggle. I turned to the Gospel of Matthew this morning, and in the Gospel of Matthew, the 8th chapter, we have this short story about Jesus in a boat on a lake, quieting the storm. He's been teaching and proclaiming. If you know your structure of Matthew, you know that this is not long after Jesus was on the shores of Galilee and the seas of Galilee, and proclaiming and teaching how to pray, and we read the Beatitudes and we read the Sermon on the Mount and all of the teaching that happened, which was really focused on finding peace in the storm, finding hope in the hopelessness, finding care and love when things seem impossible. So after all of that, we get to chapter 8 in Matthew, and we have this story. Beginning in verse 23, it says, "And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waters. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, 'Lord, save us, we are perishing.' And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid, you have little faith?' Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was dead calm. They were amazed, saying, 'What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?'" Where do you find yourself in this story? Because I know where I sit. I know I'm taking a bucket and I'm bailing water, and I'm trying to keep us afloat, and I'm trying to think of all of the positive things that we can focus on instead of the storm. Where do you find yourself? Are you helping to bail water, or are you helping to have more panic? Quite honestly, I don't think there's a wrong answer here. I think in the midst of the sea and the storm, we all find ourselves with some insecurity and some worry and some fear that can be quite consuming. And yet, Jesus is in the boat with us. God, who created the world, promised all through the Old Testament that he would never leave or forsake us. And he didn't do that as he sent his only son into this world, who would become our Savior, our hope, and our consolation for the future. Certainly he's not going to do that now. So as we look around our world, both in the tangibles and intangibles, as the floodwaters rise and the rain comes down, as we think about what's happening miles away in Washington, D.C. and other parts around this country, as we worry about conflict and hate and situations that have yet to have any resolve, where do we find ourselves in that boat? And when we look around with the people who are with us, do we see that we are not alone? Jesus is there, resting with us. To call on his name is to wake him up, I suppose, metaphorically. It's not as if God doesn't care. To call on his name is to know that he is present and that he is at work in ways that we often don't see. Sometimes I like to watch the storms just for the moment when there is peace and there is calm, because there's something beautiful in that moment. And I wonder if we had that same purview, that same reality for what's happening in our world, if we watched with prayerful, bated breath, waiting and expecting to see the calm and the peace, waiting to know God is at work. If you are in Oregon, or if not, you should Google KGW elk. There's a great video from the weekend. Cannon Beach had a winter storm. There's been king tides, which, by the way, I find fascinating and are a great illustration of this text, I think. The king tides are coming up, and there's a herd of elk in Cannon Beach that is filmed crossing the king tides. It's fascinating. It's truly fascinating. These animals have this instinct within them to herd up, to stay together, to be a community, to stay strong. They know that if they separate, they're doomed. No one had to teach them that. They just have this instinct within them. And so as the king tides are coming up and washing away lots of sand beneath these very heavy animals' feet, they make their way across the beach as one collective beast. We have a lot to learn from that herd of elks, don't we? Think about the storms we could weather with Christ as our center if we stayed as the community we're called to be. Think of what it would be like if we joined together in conversation and wrestling with what's going on as the community God has called us to be. Think of the power that we would have to withstand the storms, to withstand the struggles, to even be the hope and encouragement we most definitely need to hear as God's voice working in and among us. I hope you have a great Tuesday.